Alright, hi guys, welcome to our lesson on the pituitary gland. And a quick overview, we say the pituitary gland is actually situated below the hypothalamus. Alright, so what I did is to just zoom into the pituitary gland so that we'll see how it looks like. And this is the hypothalamus. Alright, and don't worry yourself, the hypothalamus sits up while the pituitary gland sits below it. And as we've said before, that the pituitary gland is also known as hypophysis. Okay, it's made up of two lobes, the posterior lobe and then the anterior lobe. The posterior lobe is also known as neurohypophysis, while the anterior lobe is known as the adenohypophysis. Okay, so this the gland sits on top of a bone, right? Something like this, and then this bone is known as sella turcica, right? Sella turcica, all right? So it's actually a sphenoidal bone. Okay, now, so what have we seen so far? The pituitary gland, it has two lobes, the neurohypophysis, also known as the pituitary gland, and then the anterior, also known as neurohypophysis, adenohypophysis. Now, we'll be looking at, in this lesson, we'll be looking at the posterior pituitary gland and basically the hormones, and then the hormones produced and their functions. So within this hypothalamus, we have some groups of nuclei. Remember, the posterior pituitary gland is made up of neural or neurosecretory cells, or just neurons, basically. Right, so we have some group of nuclei, right, situated or scattered around the hypothalamus. What are nuclei? Nuclei are aggregation or collection of some cell bodies, right? All right, so we have some cell bodies here that are responsible for the production of these hormones. So let's look at this first nuclei. This is known as the supraoptic nuclei. So I just abbreviated it as SON. So this is a supraoptic nuclei. So this supraoptic nuclei produces a particular hormone known as anti-diuretic hormone. Let me write it out. So it produces what? ADH. Okay, you can also call it vasopressin. All right. So anyone you want to call it, either you call it anti-diuretic hormone or you call it vasopressin. Now, after this nuclei produces this particular hormone, it is passed on through this axonal terminal, and then, or you can call it tract. Okay. Now, because when you have a bunch of axonal fibers, when you have them plenty in one place, just like a broom, when you have plenty of those axons together, they are called tracts. Okay, so this is a tract. So it passes through this tract, and then it is stored in this terminal button, or you can call it a synaptic vesicle. All right, so this is where this ADH is stored before it is now released into the bloodstream. So let's assume we have a bloodstream. You have your bloodstream like this. Okay, so this ADH gets released into the bloodstream, but we'll talk about the stimulating factor subsequently. Now, while the second nuclei, also known as the paraventricular nuclei, short form for PVN, paraventricular nuclei, produce another type of hormone known as oxytocin. Okay, so in a similar way, this oxytocin, after being produced by this paraventricular nuclei, it is passed on through this tract. All right, it's passed on through this tract, and then it's being stored in this synaptic vesicle. All right, now, so together, this region, remember, if you remember in my previous lesson, I said this region of the pituitary gland is known as the pituitary stock, or the infundibulum. So now this region is the hypothalamus, right? And then this region is the stalk. Now, so we can call this whole area, let me say this whole area like this, right? This whole area, we can call it the hypothalamo, right? Hypothalamo, right? hypophyseal tract. Okay, now why is this so? Because the pituitary gland, we said, is also known as hypophysis, right? So because we are starting from the hypothalamus, hypophyseal tract. So all of this region, right, is the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. I hope that is understood. Now let's look at each of these hormones now and look at what actually is the stimulating factor for these hormones. So we'll start with ADH, which is anti-diuretic hormone. Anti-diuretic hormone. So, but before we go into ADH, let's look at the word diuresis, right? Diuresis. Now, diuresis is a process in which, or is any chemical, right, that causes increased production of urine. Okay, so just know that diuresis is increased urine production. So, if we now have anti-diuretic, anti-diuretic now will now be a hormone that actually reduce, are you getting me? Hormone that now reduce urine output. Now, so let's look at the stimulus. What is actually the stimulus for the release of ADH from this synaptic terminal? Number one, if someone is having dehydration, for instance, someone is having either hemorrhage, blood loss, and all of that, and then the person has lost a lot of fluid from the body, it means that the volume of fluid is low, right? So we'll call that hypovolemia, right? Hypovolemia. Now, hypovolemia can actually lead to low blood pressure. So that means either hypovolemia or low blood pressure can stimulate the release of ADH. Now that is number one stimulus. Number two is when there is now increased osmotic pressure. All right, increased osmotic pressure. Let me explain that. Now, when we have when we talk about osmotic pressure, we're talking about the amount of solutes that are found within the blood. Okay, so when you have a case of someone that having dehydration, there is a lot of loss of water, the blood becomes too concentrated. Do you understand? Now, what it means now is that the pressure within the blood, or the osmotic pressure, is increased because there is a lot of dissolved substances. There is no water in the blood. So that is increased osmotic pressure. Okay, so these are the two stimulus, right, for the release of ADH. Now that we'll look at the stimulating factor, or what actually causes the release of ADH. Now, what is actually the function of ADH? Now, when any of these stimulating factors are initiated and ADH is released, first of all, it goes to the renal tubules, right? Remember your nephron, okay? Your nephron, all right? Let me just have a rough diagram, all right? Now, this is your nephron. Now, this acts on the collecting tubules, right? It acts on the collecting tubule. Who acts on that? The ADH, anti-diuretic hormone, acts on the distal convoluted tubule, right? And then the collecting duct. Now, so the ADH act on the distal convoluted tubules and then on the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct to cause what? Reabsorption of water. Remember, we said that initially what causes the release of this ADH was because the water volume is low or the blood pressure is low. So if this ADH facilitates the reabsorption of water, what do you think will happen to the low volume? It will now increase because the water going back now will help to equalize the low volume. Okay, now that means indirectly, this can be used to regulate blood pressure. Then, if that happens, what will happen to the osmotic pressure? Using the osmotic pressure will still be high or low. Now, so the osmotic pressure would have gone down since we had more water coming into the blood. Now, so that is number one function of ADH. Now, the second function of ADH is that it has a vasoconstrictive effect on the smooth muscles of the blood vessels. Now, so that is we call it vasoconstriction. All right, so it have vasoconstrictive effect, and that is why it's also called vasopressin. Okay, so these are the two main function of ADH: reabsorption of water in the renal tubules, and then vasoconstriction. And all of these help to what? Increase either the blood pressure or the volume of fluid. Now let's look at the second hormone now that is produced in the posterior pituitary gland. That is what? Oxytocin. Remember, oxytocin is produced by the paraventricular nuclei within the hypothalamus. So this hormone, let's look at the stimulating factor. Remember, the regulation for ADH is by negative feedback mechanism. That is, when you have low volume, this will stimulate the hypothalamus to release ADH. And when we have high volume, right, high volume of fluid, it also inhibits the release. So that is negative feedback. Now, but for oxytocin regulation is by positive feedback. Okay, so what's happening is that during pregnancy or during labor, the baby's head begin to stretch the cervix. Okay, and then this stretching begins to send impulses via some neuronal pathway to the hypothalamus, and this causes the release of what? The release of oxytocin. Let me just use OX to represent oxytocin. Now, when oxytocin is released from the posterior lobe, what happens? Now, let's have our little uterus. Okay, all right. Now, when this is released, oxytocin will cause increased uterine contraction. Do you understand? So there will be contraction of the smooth muscle within the uterine, thereby forcing the baby out. All right. So that's number one function of oxytocin. So it helps in what? Uterine contraction. So don't forget that, uterine contraction. Then number two function of oxytocin, it helps in milk ejection. All right, milk ejection. So what's happening is that there are some cells, myoepithelial cells within the mammary gland. So this oxytocin helps to help to eject the milk. All right. So that is the two basic function of oxytocin. We have some other functions that maybe may not be covered in this lesson, but basically these are the two functions of oxytocin. It helps in uterine contraction, and also it helps in milk production. All right, so that is just the general information that you need to know about the posterior. The posterior is also known as the neurohypophysis, and then it secretes two hormones, or it produces two hormones, and these hormones are ADH, anti-diuretic hormone, and then oxytocin. And then we've seen all of the functions of these various hormones. That is that about the posterior pituitary gland. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Thank you very much.